I heard it first as a hollow cry drawn through the ribs of the world, rising over the Hudson Bay ice like wind in a dead cathedral. The dogs flattened to their bellies, the very air seeming to thin. Our lantern hissed and shrank. Henderson's breath smoked in frantic bursts beside me as we watched the snow ahead sag inward, as if something vast and unseen pressed up from beneath. Men have pressed me, in clubs and counting houses, to tell this as a fireside amusement. I fear it is no such thing. Yet if you would hear more of these northern journeys and set down your own thoughts, lend your approval, mark your interest, and leave your recollections, that I may know which paths others would have chosen. To understand what brought us to that sinking patch of snow and that unholy cry, I must return to the beginning of the Brigade, when our concerns were of pelts, profit, and the reliable treachery of the spring ice. It was May of 1894 when we left York Factory, the great stone depot of the Hudson Bay Company, crouched at the mouth of the Hayes River. I served then as clerk and surveyor, 29 years of age, with a sound respect for ledgers, sextants, and the orderly laws of nature. The brigade was bound westward along the coast and inland via the Nelson and smaller waterways to collect the winter's furs from the remote posts and carry them back before the summer thaw made the rivers unruly. We had 3 York boats, broad and sturdy, each manned by a mixed crew of Orkneymen, French Canadians, and Cree voyageurs who knew every bend of the coast. Our leader was Chief Trader Malcolm Ross, a hard, spare Scotsman whose beard had gone white in the service of the company. Beside him were Henderson, a young English factor newly come from London Baptiste Lavore, our bowman and steersman, and Matthew Crane, a taciturn American hunter engaged for his marksmanship and his habit of saying very little. We carried the usual freight: flour, pemmican, tea, trade goods for the inland posts, rifles and shot, axes, tarred repair rope, 2 brass compasses, a sextant, and enough candles and oil to see us through the short northern nights. The bay ice still held in great pans and pressure ridges, but the shore leads had opened enough for the York boats to slip along, their oars creaking in a rhythm that had scarcely changed in a century. The first days were ordinary in the way that only hard labor can be. We rose in the grey, pushed off, and pulled at the oars until our hands blistered and then hardened. The air smelled of salt and rot, of thawing mud and distant spruce. At night, we drew the boats up on gravel spits or low rock, pitched canvas, and boiled tea in blackened kettles while the men smoked and traded stories. The first oddity was so small that, at the time, I did not mark it. On the 3rd evening, as we camped on a low island of stone and dwarf willow, the wind dropped so suddenly that the smoke from our fire rose straight as a mast. The bay, which had muttered and cracked all day, fell silent. Even the gulls on the floe edge ceased their screaming and settled, heads tucked. It is as if someone has put a glass over us, Henderson remarked, rubbing his hands by the fire. He had the soft look of a man unacquainted with hunger. Baptiste spat thoughtfully into the flames. "Sometimes the bay holds her breath," he said. "You will hear her again soon enough, monsieur." I remember smiling at that, for it sounded to me like the superstition of men too long from cities. I recorded nothing of it in my log that night, noting only our position by dead reckoning and the state of the ice. It was later that same evening that the first human moment fixed itself in my memory, perhaps because of the contrast with what followed. We had finished our meal, and the men had fallen into a comfortable silence, mending mittens and pipe stems. The light lingered on the horizon in that peculiar northern fashion, neither day nor night. Henderson sat beside me on an upturned cask, turning his tin cup in his hands. When we returned, he said, "I am to be married in Sussex. My father has arranged it. She is the daughter of a wool merchant. I have seen her twice." He said it without complaint, only a kind of abstract curiosity, as if the marriage were an expedition for which he must prepare his accounts. "Do you look forward to it?" I asked. He considered. "I look forward to being done with apprenticeships," he said at last, "to having my own house, my own books, to being settled. This," he gestured at the ice and the low dark shore, "is an interlude, a story to tell my children, perhaps." Baptiste, listening, chuckled. "You tell them about the black flies and the sore backs, monsieur. They will not thank you." Crane only stared out toward the bay, where the ice fields lay dim and motionless. "Some stories," he said quietly, "you do not tell your children." I remember thinking him overly grim, and perhaps a little theatrical. I had not yet learned how seldom such men spoke without cause. 3 days later, the brigade left the more familiar stretches and turned northwest along a less travelled arm of the coast, a route chosen to avoid heavy pressure. Ice reported farther south. The shore here was low and marshy, broken by inlets and scattered stands of spruce. We saw fewer signs of life. No distant smoke from Cree camps, no caribou on the ridges, only the occasional fox track stitched across the snow patches that still lingered inland. On the 7th day, we made camp near the mouth of a nameless river that emptied into the bay in a broad fan of brown water. The air had grown colder again, and a faint mist rose from the meeting of fresh and salt. The dogs, tethered near the boats, whined and paced more than usual, though there was no storm scent on the wind. That night, as I lay in my blanket listening to the snoring of the men and the slow grind of distant ice, I became aware of another sound, so faint at first that I thought it a trick of the blood in my ears. It was a low, hollow note, like a man blowing across the mouth of a vast bottle. It rose and fell with no rhythm I could fix, sometimes near, sometimes far, as if moving beneath the ice. I sat up, heart beating faster. The sound faded. After a time, I lay down again, telling myself it was the bay shifting, or wind in some unseen channel of rock. I did not wake the others. One does not disturb exhausted men for the sake of a noise. In the morning, the dogs were restless and had chewed at their tethers, something they had never done before. One, a big grey brute called Jonah, had blood on his muzzle, though there was no wound I could find. Crane examined the animals with a hunter's eye and said nothing. The days that followed brought more such small disquietudes. We would hear, at odd hours, that same hollow tone, sometimes so deep it seemed to press upon the chest. Once, as we hauled the boats over a narrow lead clogged with rotten ice, the sound came so near that the water at our feet shivered in concentric rings, though no wind stirred. The men paused, oars in hand, and looked at one another. "Pressure ridge settling," Ross said briskly. "Keep at it." His voice had the quality of a man explaining something more to himself than to others. Tracks began to appear along the shore, where the tide had withdrawn and left a band of wet sand and seaweed. At first, they were only strange in that we could not match them to any beast we knew. They were larger than wolf, narrower than bear, with 4 forward pads and a 5th set back, as if some heavy spur had pressed there. The distance between each print was greater than a man's stride, yet the gait was wrong for any running animal, too regular, too measured. Perhaps a moose with the edges of the hoof broken, I suggested on that first morning, crouched beside the marks with my notebook. In the salt? Crane shook his head. And walking thus? No. Baptiste muttered something in Cree under his breath and refused to step in the prints. When I asked him what he had said, he only shrugged and busied himself with the packs. Had I understood then the nature of that reluctance, I might have pressed him harder. But I was still in the first stage of my rationalizing, and there is a peculiar comfort in thinking the world must conform to one's categories. We met our first human sign since York Factory on the 10th day, when a small party of Cree hunters appeared on a low-rise inland, watching us with still faces. Ross hailed them, and they came down, their snowshoes whispering over the crusted drifts. They wore the look of men who have been too long in a country that does not care whether they live or die. Ross traded tobacco and tea for news of the interior. The men spoke little English, but Baptiste interpreted. There was game inland, they said, but the caribou had changed their routes. The winter had been strange. The ice had groaned at night in a way their fathers had not heard. One of the older men, his face lined like wind-carved bark, pointed toward the north with his chin and spoke at length, his eyes never leaving Ross. Baptiste hesitated before translating. He says, "There is a place along this coast where the ice is thin when it should be thick," he said, "where the sound is wrong. He says the old people used to say there is a hollow under the bay there, a place that is not for men. They do not hunt near it." Ross's mouth thinned. Ask him if he has seen this place himself. There was an exchange. The old man's eyes shifted away. He says no, Baptiste said quietly, but his brother did. He did not come back. Ross made a dismissive noise and pressed on with questions about furs and river levels. When the hunters had gone, he turned to us. "We will keep to our course," he said. "These stories grow with the telling. The company has used this route for years." "In summer," Crane observed. "By canoe and close to shore." Ross ignored him. The matter, so far as he was concerned, was settled. That night, the hollow sound returned, louder than before. I woke to find my breath pluming in the air, though the fire still burned. The canvas of the tent sagged inward, as if some great hand pressed upon it, then sprang back. The sound rose, a drawn-out moan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. Henderson cried out in his sleep. Outside, the dogs broke into a frantic chorus of barking, and then, abruptly, fell silent. By morning, one of the smaller dogs was gone. The tether rope lay on the snow, frayed as if abraded by stone. There was no blood, no tracks leading away, only the wide, smooth band where the rope had dragged back and forth in the night. "We should turn inland," Crane said, his jaw set. "Take the river. The ice is wrong here." Ross's face was grey with fatigue and something like anger. "We have a schedule," he said. "The inland route will add days. The spring thaw will catch us. The company does not pay us to chase phantoms." "And if it is not a phantom?" Crane asked. Ross looked at the men who stood in a ragged semicircle, their eyes downcast. "Any man who wishes to leave the brigade may do so," he said. "Take your share of the provisions and strike inland. I will not stop you, but I will not change the course for the sake of tails and a missing dog." No one moved. The North Coast is not a country one crosses lightly, even to flee an unease one cannot name. In the end, we loaded the boats and pushed on. It was around this time that my explanations, though I clung to them, began to fray. The hollow sound could perhaps be the resonance of shifting ice. I told myself, some peculiarity of the bay's underwater topography. The tracks might be distorted by thaw and refreezing. The missing dog had slipped his tether and wandered as dogs will. Yet other things did not fit so easily. The air grew colder the farther we went against the natural course of the season. A faint odor, like old kelp and iron, would drift over us without warning, though no open water lay near. Once, as we passed a stretch of unbroken shore, every man in the boat turned his head at the same instant, as if some unheard call had sounded. There was nothing there, only low rock and snow, but the sensation of being watched was so strong that I felt the hair rise on my arms. The micro-shock that shattered my remaining complacency came on the 14th day, in the full light of afternoon. We had halted to take soundings near a narrow lead between two fields of shorefast ice. The water there was darker than the surrounding bay, with a sluggish, oily movement. I stood in the bow with the lead line, calling depths to Ross at the steering oar. 10 fathoms, I said. 11, 12. The numbers did not match the chart, which showed a gradual shoaling toward the shore. I frowned and paid out more line. 14, 15. The men shifted uneasily. The water so near the coast should not have been so deep. I drew in the line to check the lead. The weight came up clean. No mud, no weed. I was about to lower it again when the boat gave a sudden, violent lurch, as if something vast had brushed against its hull from below. The oars flew from the men's hands. Henderson cried out and fell backward. The dogs on the ice began to howl, a thin, crazed sound. For an instant, as I clutched the gunwale, I felt a pressure against the soles of my feet, a slow, rolling ascent, like the back of some immense creature turning beneath us. The hollow note rose at the same moment, so loud now that the planks of the boat vibrated, the very air seeming to thicken. Then it was gone. The boat rocked gently in the swell. The lead line hung straight and still. What in God's name was that? Henderson whispered. Ground swell, Ross said hoarsely. A piece of ice carving somewhere offshore. Back to your oars. But there was no crash of falling ice, no distant roar, only the fading echo of that impossible sound. From that moment, my mind inhabited two worlds at once. In one, I remained the rational clerk, noting soundings and distances, calculating our progress, offering explanations that grew ever more strained. In the other, quieter but more insistent, I began to consider the possibility that there was something under the bay that did not belong to our catalogues. The men changed as the days lengthened. Laughter grew rare. Conversations, when they occurred, were short and practical. At night, we lay awake longer, listening. The hollow sound came more frequently, sometimes so low as to be almost below hearing, felt more in the bones than in the ear. Once, in the small hours, I woke to find Crane sitting upright, rifle across his knees, staring toward the black line of the shore. "Do you hear it?" I whispered. He nodded. "It is moving," he said, "along with us, keeping pace." "An echo," I said, though I knew that was no answer. "Perhaps." He did not take his eyes from the darkness. "Do not look into the leads alone." On the 17th day we reached the stretch of coast the Cree had warned us of, though we did not know it at first. There was no signpost, no change in the low, monotonous shore. The ice, if anything, looked more solid here, fused into a single white plane that stretched to the horizon. We camped on a tongue of gravel that jutted into the frozen bay. The sky was clear, the air so still that the smoke from our fire rose in a straight, unwavering column. The dogs lay in a tight knot, their bodies pressed together, eyes half closed but never fully asleep. That night, the hollow sound did not come as a distant moan, but as a steady, pulsing tone, like a great breath drawn in and held, drawn in and held. The snow under our blankets seemed to tremble with it. My teeth ached. The men lay rigid in their furs, eyes wide open in the dimness. "It is under us," Henderson whispered. "It is directly under us." "Be quiet," Ross hissed. "You will set the men off." In the morning, the world had changed in a way that was at first difficult to name. The light seemed flatter, the horizon closer. When I walked to the edge of the gravel spit and looked out over the ice, a peculiar vertigo seized me, as if I stood at the lip of some great height. The ice appeared perfectly level, yet some part of my body insisted that it fell away. We broke camp in silence. The plan was to push along the shore as quickly as possible, skirting this stretch before the weather could trap us. The men moved with the dull obedience of those who see no good choices left. It was that evening that we reached the place of the sinking snow, and the hollow howl reached its full, dreadful voice. The bay lay under a sky of iron, the sun a pale smear low in the west. We had made poor time, the men tiring more quickly than usual, as if the air itself fought each breath. When Ross called a halt, there was a sense of relief out of all proportion to the hour. We drew the boats up and made a small fire in the lee of a hummocked drift. I went out with Crane to fetch ice for melting. We walked only a little way from camp, not wishing to stray. The ice here was oddly smooth, its usual ridges and fractures softened, as if something beneath had pressed up and ironed them flat. My boots squeaked faintly with each step. "Look," Crane said suddenly, crouching. At first I saw nothing. Then my eyes adjusted and I realized that the faint shadows on the ice around us were not random. They formed impressions, shallow but distinct, where the snow had been compressed in shapes like those we had seen along the shore. 4 forward pads, a 5th set back. The prints overlapped and crossed, as if many heavy things had passed here, and recently. They led in no single direction, but spiraled and looped, a senseless pattern that made my head swim to follow. "They are old," I said weakly. "Drifts and thaws." "They are not old," Crane replied. "Feel." He pressed his gloved hand to one of the depressions, then to the untouched ice beside it. "Here," he said. "It is colder. I did the same." He was right. The air above the prints held a chill that bit through the wool, sharper than the already bitter evening. We returned to camp with less ice than we should have brought. I could not shake the sensation of those spiraling tracks under my feet, of some great pattern inscribed upon the bay that we were too small and too frightened to read. After we had eaten, Ross called us close. "We are in a cursed place," he said without preamble. "I will not pretend otherwise. We will travel by night and rest by day until we are clear of it. The ice is sound enough to bear us. We keep together, no wandering. No one goes off alone for any reason." "What of the sound?" Henderson asked. His face was drawn, his eyes bloodshot. "We ignore it," Ross said. "We do our work, that is all." Of course, we did not ignore it. We could not. As the last light drained from the sky and we set out again, the hollow tones swelled, no longer intermittent but a continuous rising cry that seemed to circle us, to coil under and around the boats. The dogs refused to move at first, digging their paws into the snow, ears flattened. Only the lash and curses drove them on, and even then they pulled in jerks and starts, as if they expected the ground to give way. The peak encounter began with a change in that sound. It shifted from a single drawn-out note to something like a voice, though no human throat could have made it. There were modulations now, rises and falls that suggested intention, even a kind of question, though the language was not one I could name. My skin crawled. The men muttered prayers in French, in Cree, in English. Then, ahead of us, the snow sagged. It did not crack or heave or break in the familiar ways of failing ice. It simply settled, as if some great hollow had opened beneath it. The depression spread outward in a slow, inexorable circle, the center dropping, the edges bending down like the inside of a vast bowl. The hollow cry rose in pitch, vibrating in my bones. "Back!" Ross shouted. "Back to the shore!" The dogs had already turned, scrambling, their claws tearing at the snow. The men stumbled after them, dragging the boats, slipping and cursing. I looked back once against all reason and saw the center of the sinking circle darken, the snow thinning to a grey slush through which something black and smooth pressed upward, not breaking the surface but distorting it, like a face against thin cloth. There were no eyes, no features I could name, only a sense of immensity, of something not made for light. The hollow howl became, for one shattering instant, a round, focused sound, directed toward us like a beam. My vision blurred, my ears rang. I could not breathe. A hand seized my collar and hauled me backward. It was Crane. "Move," he said. His voice sounded as if it came from very far away. We ran. Behind us, the sinking circle widened. The snow at its edges cracked at last, breaking into plates that tilted and slid inward. A cold wind rushed past us, drawn toward that opening, smelling of iron and salt and a deep, old rot. The hollow voice dropped again to its earlier tone, but now I could hear beneath it a wet, grinding sound, as of great things shifting in a confined space. We reached the gravel spit and did not stop until we were on its highest point. Only then did we turn. The circle had stopped expanding perhaps 200 yards from shore. In its center, the ice had vanished, replaced by a black surface that was not quite water and not quite anything I had seen before. It did not move as water moves, but in slow, viscous undulations, as if it were thicker, heavier. The edges of the circle steamed faintly in the cold air. The hollow sound diminished, then ceased altogether. The sudden silence was so complete that I heard my own pulse hammering in my ears. No one spoke. Even Ross seemed beyond words. We stood there, a ragged line of men and dogs and half-dragged boats, staring at that impossible opening in the bay. Then, from the far side of the circle, something moved. It was only a shadow against the dim ice beyond, a low gliding shape that slipped along the rim and was gone. It might have been a trick of the light. It might have been nothing at all. Yet every man saw it, and every man flinched as one. "That is enough," Ross said at last, his voice hoarse. "We leave. Now. We go inland. We will haul the boats over the ridge if we must." No one argued. The immediate aftermath was a blur of labor and a kind of stunned obedience. We did not sleep that night. We dragged the boats up over the gravel and into the low, scrub-filled rises beyond, following a shallow ravine that led inland. The snow there was crusted and uneven, the going hard. Men stumbled and cursed. One of the boats slipped and nearly crushed a man's leg. No one spoke of the circle on the bay. It was as if some unspoken pact had formed. To name it was to grant it further reality. The dogs, freed from the sight of the bay, moved more willingly, though they still started at every stray sound. Once, as we paused to rest, Jonah lifted his head and stared back toward the shore, lips peeled from his teeth in a silent snarl. I did not look. By dawn, we had reached a low line of spruce. The sight of trees, however stunted, brought a disproportionate comfort. Among them, the wind sounded like wind again. The hollow note did not follow us there, or if it did, it was lost among the branches. We made a hasty camp and collapsed in our blankets. Sleep came in fits, broken by dreams of sinking snow and black, heaving surfaces. Once I woke with my hands clawing at my throat, convinced that the air had thickened into that same viscous substance. When we set out again, Ross's authority had altered. The men obeyed him still, but there was a new, brittle quality to their obedience, as if they had seen him measured against something greater than any company order. He, for his part, spoke little, his eyes fixed ahead, his jaw clenched. Henderson changed the most. The young man who had spoken of Sussex and arranged marriages seemed to have been left on the shore with the sinking snow. He moved like an automaton, his face slack, his gaze unfocused. Once, as we labored over a rise, I heard him muttering under his breath. "What are you saying?" I asked. "It was looking at us," he replied without turning. Without eyes, it was looking at us. It wanted to know if we would break. I had no answer to that. The return journey became not a route, but an escape. We abandoned the coastal plan entirely and struck inland for the nearest known river, intending to follow it, however circuitous, back toward York Factory. The land there was a maze of muskeg and low ridges, dotted with frozen ponds. The weather turned against us, as if the country wished to test us further. A wet snow began to fall, clinging to the spruce, dampening clothes and spirits. Our provisions, calculated for a shorter journey, began to run low. Yet, for all that, there was a sense among us that any hardship inland was preferable to a single further day upon that stretch of coast. No one suggested we return to the bay, even when the hauling grew so hard that men vomited from the effort. There were small incidents along the way that showed how close to the edge we walked. One evening, as we made camp by a half-frozen stream, a spruce hen blundered almost into our fire, dazed. Crane raised his rifle automatically, then lowered it and caught the bird with his hands instead, wringing its neck. The men fell upon the scant meat with a kind of savage gratitude. When one of the younger voyageurs complained that the portioning was unfair, a fight nearly broke out. Only Ross shouted oath, and the sight of his drawn pistol stopping it. Another time, in the grey of early morning, I woke to find Baptiste standing over me, his hand half extended toward my throat. His eyes were unfocused, his lips moving. When I spoke his name, he started violently, stumbling back as if struck. "I was not," he began, then faltered. "I dreamed I was pulling you from the ice," he said. His hand shook. "I am sorry, mon ami. It is nothing," I lied. But I slept no more that night. We heard the hollow sound only once more on that journey, faint and far to the north, as we crested a low ridge. It came on the wind like a memory, a distant, drawn-out note that set our teeth on edge. Every man stopped. No one spoke. When it faded, we moved on more quickly, as if the sound had been a spur. At last, After what felt like an age, but was in truth less than a fortnight since the sinking snow, we reached the Hayes River and the more familiar route back to York Factory. The sight of the brown, ice-clogged water winding between its banks brought tears to more than one hardened face. Our arrival at the post was less triumphant than our departure. We came in, leaner, quieter, our clothes ragged, our faces burned and hollow. The men at the fort stared at us with a curiosity that shifted swiftly to unease when they saw our expressions. The chief factor, a stout man named Fleming, received us in his office, where the walls were lined with ledgers and the air smelled of ink and pipe smoke. He listened to Ross's preliminary account with a frown, his fingers steepled. "You altered the agreed route," he said at last. "You abandoned the coastal path and came inland, adding days to the journey. Why?" Ross's gaze flicked to me, then to Crane, then back to Fleming. "The ice was unsound," he said. "There was a danger of breakup. I judged it safer to come inland," Fleming grunted. "We have used that route before." "In summer," Ross replied. "Conditions change." Fleming's eyes narrowed. "You lost one dog team and 2 men to frostbite and exhaustion. The pelts from Nelson House are late. The company will ask questions." Ross's jaw tightened. "I will answer them." It was then that Fleming looked to me. "You kept a log, did you not?" he asked. "You are a clerk." "I did," I said. "You will prepare an official report," he said. "Distances, conditions, reasons for the change of route. The London office will require clarity." In the days that followed, as the men dispersed to the bunkhouses and the warm, noisy refuge of the mess hall, I sat at a small desk under a fly-specked window and tried to fit what we had seen into words that would not mark me as a madman. The official account, which still lies in some company archive, reads thus: "On the 14th day encountered unusual ice conditions along the north coast. Noted evidence of subsurface instability, including sudden depressions and anomalous soundings indicating greater depth than charted. Judged the ice unsafe for further travel with loaded boats. Elected to withdraw to shore and proceed inland via unmarked route, resulting in additional days' travel and loss of some provisions. Recommend future brigades avoid this section of coast in late spring. There is no mention of the hollow Howl, of the sinking snow, of the black, heaving surface. There is no description of the pattern of tracks, of the cold above them, of the sense of being measured by something for which we had no name." I showed a draft to Ross before submitting it. He read it in silence, then nodded. "It will do," he said. "It is not the truth," I replied. "It is the truth that can be used," he said. "The other truth will do no one any good. Do you wish to be known as the man who saw monsters in the ice?" I thought of my prospects, of the company, of the narrowness of the world in which a clerk might make his way. I thought of the look in Fleming's eyes when Ross had mentioned unsound ice. I signed the report. There were murmurs, of course. Men talk in bunkhouses and on riverbanks. A voyageur who had heard a fragment of our story from one of my crew cornered me once, months later, and asked, half joking, if it was true that the bay had opened under our feet. "Do not be foolish," I said. "The ice was thin, that is all." He laughed and slapped my shoulder, relieved. I felt the lie settle in me like a stone. The years that followed were outwardly unremarkable. I left the company service in 1897, married, and took a position in a counting house in Montreal. I had children. I grew stout. I learned to read the price of furs and wheat and coal from the newspapers Instead of from ledgers written in my own hand, the north receded, as distant and improbable as a tale from boyhood. Yet it did not leave me. The first scene that returns when I think of that time came some 3 years after the Brigade, on an autumn evening in Montreal. I was walking home along St. Catherine Street, the shop lamps throwing warm pools of light on the wet cobbles. A street musician, half drunk, was attempting to play a horn of some sort in a nearby lane. He blew a long, wavering note that caught in the narrow space between the buildings and deepened, picking up a resonance from some unseen cavity. For a heartbeat, the sound was that same hollow tone from the bay. My legs went weak. I had to catch myself on a lamppost. The bustle of the street, the clatter of carriage wheels, the calls of vendors, all fell away. I was on the ice again, the snow sagging, the air thinning, the hollow howl pressing against my bones. "Sir, are you unwell?" someone asked. A stranger, his face blurred. I began, then stopped. How could I explain that a single note from a cheap horn had opened a pit under my feet? "I am quite well," I said at last. I merely slipped. For weeks afterward, any low, sustained sound, a train passing over a bridge, the wind in a chimney, would make my heart race. I took to sleeping with cotton in my ears, to my wife's confusion. The second scene came later in 1902, when I received a letter bearing the company's seal. It was from Ross, now retired and living in Edinburgh. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but the words were still spare. "Crane is dead," it read. "He was lost on a hunting trip in the Rockies. His companion reports that he went out onto the ice of a frozen lake to examine some tracks and did not return. There was a sound," he says, "like a great breath drawn under the ice. No sign of him was found. I thought you should know. I read the letter 3 times. My hands shook. The coincidence was too precise, too cruel. Yet what could I say? That the thing under Hudson Bay had reached across a continent to take a man who had once defied it. That it remembered us? I wrote back to Ross, a stilted, formal note expressing my condolences. I did not mention the hollow sound. He did not write again. In the years since, I have attempted, in my quieter hours, to fit our experience into some framework that would allow me to rest. I have read what little the libraries hold on the geology of Hudson Bay, on its peculiar shallowness, and the theories of great basins carved by ancient ice. I have read accounts of Inuit and Cree traditions, of the Tuangite and other spirits that move under ice and water. I have even, in my more desperate moments, considered the newer speculations of men who speak of vibrations and unseen forces, of the earth as a resonant body. None of it has sufficed. Once, about a decade after the Brigade, I travelled to London on business and, on a damp afternoon, found my way to the company's archives. There, in a quiet room that smelled of dust and leather, I requested the records of the 1894 Hudson Bay Fur Brigades. The clerk, unaware of the irony, brought me my own report. I read it again, the measured phrases about subsurface instability and anomalous soundings. It felt like a document from another life. There was no mention of Henderson's mutterings, of Baptiste's sleepwalking hand, of Jonah's silent snarl. No trace of the thing that had looked up at us through the thinning snow. On impulse, I asked if there were any other reports of unusual ice conditions along that stretch of coast in other years. The clerk obliged, bringing me volumes from the 1870s, the 1880s, the early 1900s. I leafed through them, my pulse quickening whenever I saw the words ice, route change, unsound. There were hints, nothing more. A brigade in 1873 that had experienced unsettling vibrations in the ice near the north coast elected to proceed inland. Another in 1881 that had lost one boat to sudden ice failure in calm conditions. A note in the margin of a 1905 report, in a different hand, men uneasy, spoke of the bay singing. No one had written what we had seen. Or, if they had, those pages were not in the volumes I was shown. I left the archive with a sense not of revelation, but of confirmation. Whatever lay under that stretch of Hudson Bay had been there before us and would remain after. We were not its first witnesses, nor, I fear, its last. In my own house, there are few who know the full story. My wife has heard a softened version, one in which the ice broke under us in a more ordinary fashion. My children know only that their father once went north and came back thinner. When my son, as a boy, asked me if there were monsters in the sea, I told him no. I do not know whether that was kindness or cowardice. Ross and I exchanged a few more letters over the years, mostly about mundane matters. In one, written shortly before his death, he allowed himself a single, unguarded sentence. Sometimes, he wrote, when the wind is in a certain quarter, I hear it again, even here, far from the bay. I tell myself it is only the sea in the Firth, but I am not always convinced. I have had similar moments. In the quiet of night, when the city's noise has ebbed, a distant train will pass, and its low, drawn-out whistle will catch on the buildings in such a way that, for an instant, the room seems to tilt, the air to thin. Or I will be in a church, the organ sounding a sustained note, and feel the pew vibrate faintly under my hands, as if something deeper than wood and stone had been set in motion. In those moments, I am back on the gravel spit, the snow sinking, the men frozen in a line, the black surface rising beneath the thinning crust. I feel again the way my mind recoiled, not only from fear, but from the affront to its categories. The world I had known, of charted coasts and predictable seasons, had made no room for a hollow under the bay that could move and listen and call. What haunts me most is not the vision of that black, heaving surface, nor even the hollow howl itself, though I hear it still in the quiet hours. It is the image of the tracks on the ice, spiraling and looping in patterns that made no sense to us. They spoke of movement, of repetition, of some purpose carried out over time beyond our measure. We were, I think, no more to that presence than the faint shadow of a bird crossing its field. I have come, in these later years, to a kind of acceptance, not of what the thing was, for I do not know and will never know, but of the fact that there are chambers in the world, hollows under ice and in the mind, that our instruments and equations cannot yet sound. The north keeps its own counsel. The bay sings to itself in a key we do not hear, until by mischance we step upon the thin places. When I lie awake now, old bones aching, the city quiet beyond the window, it is not the full horror of that night that rises most vividly, but a smaller, more concrete detail. I feel, with startling clarity, the way the snow gave under my boot as we stood on the ice before it sank, not in a sharp break, but in a slow, yielding subsidence, as if some vast lung beneath had drawn in breath and waited.